and welcome. Today I'm going to show you how to put a frill around the edge of a quilt as you go quilt. This is the quilt I made last week, made from a disappearing 4-patch block, and I put it together as a quilt as you go. If you haven't already seen that video, I'll share a link to it at the end. But for now, we're going to concentrate on putting a frill around the edge of our quilt as you go quilt. So let's get started.
To find how much fabric you will need, take twice your width and twice your length and add it together. This was 196 inches for my quilt. Then divide your answer by 2, which in my case was 98 inches. Add this measurement to the length of your quilt, which gives you 1.5 times the length of your quilt. Then divide this measurement by the width of your fabric, which in my case was 40 inches, and you'll find out how many strips to cut. I needed just over 7 strips, so I cut 8. To find out the length of the fabric you need, you multiply the number of strips by the width of your strip. So in my case, it's 8 times 2.5 inches, which is 20 inches. I cut 8 strips of fabric, all 2.5 inches wide. If you wanted a fuller frill, you could cut 2 times the length of your quilt instead of 1.5. If you want a fuller frill, take the measurement of your quilt all the way around it and double that measurement, and that's how long you want your strips to be. To join your pieces together, you'll need to take your first piece and place it right side up on your cutting mat, and place the piece that you're going to join right side down at right angles on your cutting mat and pin in place, and draw a sewing line from the top left hand corner of the top piece down to bottom right hand corner of the bottom piece. Then sew together along the line that you've just drawn. I back tack at the start and the finish of this. Repeat this process to join all of your pieces together. Then you can press your seams open with a nice hot iron. Next, join the length together so it's in one continuous piece. To do this, line up both of your ends at right angles, and with the bottom piece right side facing up and the top piece right side facing down. Make sure there are no twists or kinks in your fabric. Then line up your ruler to draw a line at 45 degrees. Then put a pin either side of the line that you've just drawn. Then sew directly on the line that you have just drawn, back tacking at the start and the finish. Cut off the ends and then you can press your seam. I'm just finger pressing it here, and there it is. Just need to cut that little bit off the top there, and there we are. Our whole frill is now joined together. Next, fold your fabric in half down the centre, so you're folding it lengthways, and then press with a hot iron and continue all the way around the whole length of your fabric. Next, you will need to put 4 marks on your frill at equal distances apart. So first you need to fold your frill fabric in half to find the 2 midpoints. Mark the 2 points with a fabric pen. Sorry, you can't really see what I'm doing here, but I'm marking the 2 midpoints with a fabric pen at either side of the fabric. And I should just point out, this isn't actually the frill. I forgot to film this part when I was making the frill, and by the time I realised it was too late. So this is just a random length of fabric, but it's the same idea, marking at the halfway marks and the quarter marks. So you should end up with 4 marks equal distances apart, to make it easier for you to spread your gathers more evenly when you come to attach your frill to your quilt. Then set your sewing machine up for the largest straight stitch, and then you're going to sew all the way around your frill, but we're going to stop sewing and then restart again at each of our marks we made on our frill. You get to the first mark, stop sewing, lift up your presser foot and needle and break off your thread with a long tail end, and then get as close as you can to that sewing with a small gap and start again, and continue along to your next mark when you'll do exactly the same thing. Continue all the way around your strip, and then do exactly the same with the second row all the way around the strip, breaking at the same points as with the first row. Before you attach the frill to the quilt, you need to round off the corners, so just use a plate or something rounded, draw around it and cut around the marks with your fabric scissors, and do exactly the same to all 4 of the corners. Next, you'll need to make 4 marks on your quilt so that you can match up your frill with the marks on your quilt. If you remember, on the frill we put 4 marks at the halfway marks and the quarter marks. I'm going to do exactly the same on the quilt. When you've made your 4 marks on your quilt, you need to match up the marks on your frill with the marks on your quilt, so that you have all your quarter marks joined together and all your halfway marks joined together, and then you can start to gather. This way the gathers can be spread evenly throughout the quilt and you don't have all your gathers in one place. Start gathering between the first 2 marks. When you think you've gathered your frill sufficiently so that it will fit in the area, then you can start pinning it. You may need to move the gathers about as you go along, get it to a length that you think is about right, and then start pinning into place. And if you need to, as you go along, you can move those gathers around or pull them a little bit tighter if need be. When you've finished working on the first quarter of your quilt, you can then move along to the next quarter and do exactly the same. Pull the gathers tight, or as tight as you need to get them to fit, and then pin them in place. Continue all the way around your quilt until you get back to where you started from, and by this time you should have all of your frill nicely fitting all the way around the edge of your quilt. I made my own bias binding, but if you want to buy it from the shop, you'll need to buy 1/2 inch bias binding single fold. Start attaching your bias binding at the centre of one of your sides. Fold the edge of the binding that you are adding to the quilt. It should be folded over and you need to unfold it in order to attach it, and leave a good 12-inch gap and a good long tail end when you start, and place it face down on top of your frill. Then pin in place all the way around your quilt, being very careful around the corners, and probably be putting a few extra pins in on those corners. But because you've cut the tape on the bias, it means, or if you've bought shop bought bias tape, it means it will easily fold around the corners without too much difficulty. Carry on pinning your binding all the way around your quilt until you get back to where you started from, and it's the same as at the beginning. You're going to leave a gap, the 12-inch gap, but you're also going to leave a long tail end on your bias binding tape ready to join it to the other side once you've attached it. Sew your binding to your frill and quilt, and remember to change your stitch length back to your normal sewing stitch length. Back tacking at the start and the finish, and taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's easy to see where to sew because the 1/4 inch seam allowance is marked on your binding. It's the side where you opened it out, and there will be a slight fold for you to sew along. So sew all the way around, removing your pins as you go along, back tacking at the start and the finish. And remember to start a little bit away from the middle, because remember you're leaving a 12-inch opening, and then when you get to the end you're going to finish before you get to the end, so you can allow yourself that 12-inch opening. And you're also going to make sure, but you should have done this when you pinned anyway, that you've got a good long tail end at each end, enough that the 2 pieces will cross over and have plenty of room for you to join them together. Make a mark on the centre, or roughly the centre of the opening. I'm using a friction pen, but any pen will do for this. Then make a mark on both sides of your bias binding tapes at that centre mark. Line each side of the binding up with this mark, lower them slightly, and then add a mark onto the binding. Then find your mark on the right hand piece of bias binding and add an extra inch to that side. This is to allow for your join. Draw a line all the way across and then cut. Then cut the left hand side piece of bias binding on the original line. That's the one that lines up with the mark you made on your frill. Take the right hand piece of bias binding, open it out and lay it down face up. Then take the left hand piece and place that on top of the right hand piece with right sides together. And then you're going to put a pin in it and draw a line across at 45 degrees. And sew your 2 pieces of bias binding together along this line, back tacking at the start and the finish. Before pressing this seam, make sure that it is right and your bias binding is going to fit. Then once you're sure of that, you can trim down the seam and press the seam open, or in my case I just finger pressed it open. Then pin in place before taking over to your sewing machine and sewing, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Next, press the seam towards the backing of your quilt. Then fold the bias binding over, so the bias binding goes over the top of the seam and you've already got a 1/4 inch seam turned under on your bias binding, so all you need to do is pin it in place. It's quite easy and it does fall into place quite well. The only time you have difficulty is on the corners, and that's why we're using bias binding, so that we can manipulate it around the corners. As it's cut on the bias of the fabric, it means you can bend it and manipulate it to fit better. So pin all the way around your quilt, and then when you've pinned all the way around, you can either hand sew your bias binding down, or if you prefer, you can sew it on your sewing machine. It doesn't matter which way you do it. If you do it on your sewing machine, you will get a seam about 1/4 inch away from the frill, and that's fine because it really doesn't matter. But if that bothers you, then do like me and hand sew all the way around your quilt. It's a nice job to do of an evening while you're watching television. But as I say, if you don't want to hand sew it, then by all means go round on your sewing machine. And now all that's left to do is to unpick your gathering stitches. And here's the finished quilt.
Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did and you haven't already, could you please consider subscribing to my channel? Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.